Nebraska, August 1944. The wheat fields outside Grand Island stretched golden under afternoon sun, heat making the air shimmer above the harvest. 20 German POWs worked alongside American civilians, binding sheaves under armed guard supervision. 17-year-old Margaret Crawford had been explicitly forbidden by her father from speaking to the prisoners. They were the enemy. They were dangerous. They were not to be acknowledged beyond necessary work instructions. When Thomas Crawford walked to the barn at sunset to check equipment, he found his daughter sitting on hay bales with a young German prisoner, both of them holding books, both of them laughing. They were teaching each other their languages. The Crawford farm had been in the family for 3 generations. 200 acres of wheat and corn, a dozen head of cattle, chickens, 2 mules, and a work ethic that accepted no excuses. Thomas Crawford ran it with his wife Helen and their daughter Margaret, managing despite the war, taking most available labor to factories and military service. By summer 1944, the labor shortage had become critical. Wheat needed harvesting, but Crawford couldn't find enough workers at any wage. A government solution. German POWs from nearby Camp Atlanta, a branch camp of the larger facility at Fort Robinson. Prisoners would work under guard supervision, paid nominal wages, returning to camp each evening. Crawford had resisted initially. These were enemy soldiers, men who had fought Americans, who represented everything the war opposed. Allowing them on his property felt like collaboration. But wheat wouldn't wait for ideological purity. If the harvest wasn't brought in, the farm would fail. So Crawford signed the paperwork, accepted the conditions, and prepared for the first work detail the morning they arrived. 20 men in faded uniforms, marked with PW on the back, accompanied by 2 armed guards. Crawford gathered his family in the fair house. "These men are prisoners, not guests," he said. "We treat them fairly per the rules, but we don't fraternize. Work instructions only. Margaret, I'm especially serious with you. No conversations, no interactions beyond what's necessary. Is that clear?" Margaret nodded. She was 17, sharp-minded and curious daughter to her father's stubbornness and her mother's compassion. She understood the rules, even if she didn't fully agree with them. The prisoners worked efficiently. Most were experienced with agricultural labor. Germany was still largely rural, and many had grown up on farms. They understood wheat harvest, knew how to work with rhythm and care that preserved both crop and energy. One prisoner in particular caught Margaret's attention. He was young, perhaps 22, thin, like all of them, but with an alert quality that suggested intelligence beyond physical labor. He worked the binding station, tying sheaves with quick precision, occasionally speaking quietly to fellow prisoners in German. His name, she learned from overhearing. The guard's was Karl Hoffman, former student at Heidelberg University, conscripted in 1942, captured in Italy during the Allied advance. The guards treated him slightly differently, and the others? More conversation, fewer sharp commands. Margaret guessed he spoke some English. She brought water to the fields at midday, filling cups from a metal pitcher, serving the American workers and prisoners equally per regulations. When she reached Karl, he said in careful English, "Thank you, miss." The words were simple, but the accent was thick. each syllable pronounced with deliberate precision. Margaret nodded, moved on, but noticed how he watched her, not with threat or impropriety, but with something like curiosity, as if he was trying to understand this American farm, this American girl, this enemy that didn't match propaganda descriptions. Margaret's curiosity grew daily. She wanted to ask questions. What was Germany like? What did he study at university? How did he end up in Nebraska? But her father's prohibition was absolute, and the guards enforced strict limitations on prisoner-civilian interaction. So she observed, watched how the prisoners worked together with practiced coordination, noticed how they sang sometimes while working. German folk songs that drifted across the wheat fields in harmonies that sounded ancient. Saw how they treated the farm equipment with care, how they thanked her mother when she brought lunch to the fields. They weren't monsters. That became clear quickly. They were young men, far from home, doing hard work in a country that held them captive. The realization created cognitive dissonance that Margaret struggled to reconcile. Her mother noticed her distraction one evening as they washed dishes. "You're thinking about the German boys," Helen said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Father said they're dangerous, but they don't seem dangerous. They seem sad." "Sad men can still be dangerous," Helen replied. "But yes, I see it too. They're children, really. Someone else's sons doing what they were told now, trapped far from home." "Why can't we talk to them?" Margaret asked. "Just conversations, learning about each other. What harm could that do? Your father believes any connection is dangerous, that understanding the enemy makes it harder to maintain proper boundaries. He might not be wrong. But he might not be right either," Margaret said. Helen smiled slightly. "No, he might not be. But he's your father, and the rules are his to set." Margaret had always been a reader. Books stacked beside her bed, library trips to Grand Island every 2 weeks, correspondence with teachers about college possibilities after the war. Literature was her escape from far routines and small-town limitations. She kept books everywhere, including the barn, where she often read while watching summer storms approach across the plains. One afternoon, returning from the house, she found Karl standing near her reading spot, looking at a book she had left on a hay bale. He startled when she entered, stepped back, hands raised apologetically. "Sorry," he said in broken English. "I see book 1 misreading." Margaret should have told him to leave, should have reported this to the guards. Instead, she asked, "You read English?" "Some," Karl replied. "I study at university. English literature, Shakespeare, Dickens, but not good speaking." "You speak it better than I speak German," Margaret said, "which is not at all." Karl smiled cautiously. "German is difficult language, many rules. English has many. Strange." He searched for the word exceptions. "Exceptions," Margaret confirmed. "Yes. English makes no sense half the time." They stood in awkward silence, both aware this conversation violated regulations, and Karl gestured to the book. "Pride and Prejudice. You like this story?" "I love it," Margaret said. "I've read it 3 times. In Germany, we read German translation. Jane Austen, very popular. But I think translation loses music, the way English sounds. Probably, Margaret agreed. Translation always loses something. Another silence. Then Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Would you like to borrow it? The book? Karl looked shocked. This is allowed? Probably not, Margaret admitted. But if you're careful, keep it hidden, return it before you leave. Nobody needs to know. Karl took the book reverently, as if it were precious rather than a library copy with a worn cover. Thank you, he said. Thank you very much. He hid the book inside his shirt and left quickly, before anyone could observe the exchange. 3 days later, Karl returned the book, along with a note written in careful English. Thank you, Filone. I enjoy very much. If you like, I have German book I can trade. We make library between us. Learning is good, even in war. The note included a short poem in German, with English translation below. Margaret recognized it as Goethe, though the translation was rough. She should have stopped there, should have told her father, should have maintained the boundaries he had established. Instead, she wrote back, I would like to trade books. Tomorrow, I'll leave one in the barn in the usual spot. We shouldn't be seen talking, but books can speak for us. Thus began a secret exchange that would last through the harvest season. Margaret left books in the barn, novels, poetry, even her old school textbooks. Karl left German books he had somehow acquired from camp, along with notes explaining difficult passages, asking questions about English idioms, sharing observations about American literature. They developed the system. Margaret would check the hiding spot, a gap between hay bales each morning. If there was a book, she knew Karl had left something new. She would read his notes during lunch, compose responses in the evening, leave her own book and note before dawn. The books became conversations. The notes became lessons. Through written words, they taught each other languages, cultures, perspectives, all while maintaining the fiction that they never spoke, never interacted, never acknowledged each other beyond the minimum required by farm work. As weeks passed, the notes evolved into actual lessons. Margaret wrote out English grammar rules, vocabulary lists, colloquialisms. Karl responded with German equivalents, explaining linguistic structures, teaching her basic phrases. In German, we say, Ich habe Hunger, which means literally, I have hunger, not I am hungry. Different languages show possession differently is interesting, yes. Margaret found herself studying German seriously for the first time, not from textbooks, but from genuine desire to communicate. She learned greetings, basic sentences, enough vocabulary to understand the songs the prisoners sang while working. One evening, her mother found her practicing German pronunciation in her room. Helen stood in the doorway listening, and then asked, "Where did you learn that?" "From books," Margaret said quickly. "Library has a German textbook." Helen looked at her daughter with knowing eyes. "Be careful, Margaret. Whatever you're doing, be very careful. Your father wouldn't understand." "Understand what?" Margaret asked, maintaining the fiction. "That curiosity doesn't make you a traitor," Helen said. But he wouldn't see it that way. By late August, Margaret and Karl's written exchanges had become sophisticated. They discussed literature, philosophy, the differences between American and German education. Karl described Heidelberg University before the war, the old buildings, the student traditions, the professors who taught him to question everything. Margaret shared her hopes for college, her love of literature, her frustration with small-town limitations. Through books and notes, they built something that transcended the prisoner-civilian divide, an intellectual friendship based on shared curiosity and hunger for learning. One afternoon, emboldened by weeks of successful secrecy, Karl left a note suggesting they meet briefly to practice spoken language. Reading is good, but speaking is how language lives. If safe, maybe we talk, 5 minutes only. Margaret knew this was dangerous. Written notes could be hidden, but conversations could be overheard. Yet she agreed, leaving a response. Tomorrow, sunset, barn, 5 minutes. They met in the barn as planned. Margaret arrived first, nervous, certain this was a terrible idea. Karl arrived moments later, equally nervous, speaking quickly in accented English. "This is stupid risk. If caught, big trouble for both." "Then why are you here?" Margaret asked. "Because 5 minutes of real conversation worth more than 100 letters," Karl replied. "Because I miss talking to someone who understands books and ideas in world bigger than war." They sat on hay bales, the angle allowing them to see if anyone approached, but hidden from casual observation. And they talked. Quickly, urgently. 5 minutes stretching to 15, covering months of accumulated questions. Karl asked about American schools, American books, what it was like growing up with so much space and freedom. Margaret asked about Germany before the war, about university life, about what he planned to do after repatriation. Neither mentioned the war directly. Neither discussed politics or ideology or whose side was right. They simply shared the human details that propaganda tried to erase. That people were complex. That enemy soldiers could love literature. That understanding didn't require agreement. When they finally separated, both knew they would meet again, despite the risk. Over the next 2 weeks, their barn meetings became routine. Always at sunset, always brief, always focused on language and literature and ideas. The guards never noticed. Prisoners were supposed to be in the fields or trucks, not the barn. Margaret's parents never checked. She was supposed to be doing evening chores exactly where she was. They made progress. Karl's English improved dramatically with regular practice. Margaret learned enough German to read simple texts. More importantly, they developed genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared intellectual passion. Karl told her about his sister in Hamburg, about his mother who wrote letters begging him to survive and come home. Margaret told him about her brother serving with the army in France, about her fears and hopes, and the strange displacement of reading Jane Austen while the world burned. These were not romantic meetings. There was no physical intimacy, no declarations of forbidden love. Just 2 young people who had been taught to hate each other, so countries discovering they shared more than divided them. On September 5th, Thomas Crawford went to the barn at sunset to check equipment for the next day's work. He heard voices, English and German mixed together. He approached quietly, certain something terrible was happening. What? He saw his daughter and a German prisoner sitting on hay bales, books open between them, laughing at something. A prisoner was saying English words while Margaret corrected his pronunciation. She was reading German sentences from a textbook while he corrected her accent. Thomas stood frozen, processing this scene. His first instinct was rage. Explicit orders violated. Enemy soldier alone with his daughter. Unacceptable breach of rules and safety. But what he actually witnessed wasn't threat or impropriety. It was teaching, learning. Two young people sharing knowledge across the chasm of war. He cleared his throat. Both of them jumped up, faces showing guilt and fear. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly, "inside now." She left quickly, not looking at Karl. Thomas turned to the prisoner, who stood at something like attention, waiting for punishment. "You speak English?" Thomas said. "Some, sir," Karl replied. "I learned at university, before war." "And you've been teaching my daughter German?" "She teach me English. I teach her German." "Just books and words, sir. Nothing wrong." Thomas considered this. The regulation violations were severe, but the actual activity was innocent, productive even. Two young people teaching each other, bridging cultures through literature and language. Inside the farmhouse, Thomas confronted Margaret in the kitchen, while Helen watched silently. "I explicitly forbade you from talking to the prisoners," Thomas said. "I know," Margaret replied. "I'm sorry." "Sorry isn't enough. You violated my rules, put yourself in potential danger, created problems I now have to address." "I was never in danger," Margaret said. "Karl is." "I don't care what he is," Thomas interrupted. "He's a prisoner, enemy soldier. You don't befriend enemy soldiers." "Why not?" Margaret asked. "If they're not actually dangerous, if understanding them doesn't hurt anyone." "Because understanding makes everything harder," Thomas said, his voice rising. "Because your brother is over there fighting Germans, and you're here teaching one to speak better English. How does that make sense?" "It makes sense because Karl isn't fighting anyone," Margaret replied, matching his volume. "He's a prisoner on our farm, doing work we need done. And he misses books and learning and conversation. Teaching him English doesn't help Germany. It just helps a person." Helen spoke for the first time. "Thomas, sit down, both of you." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had practiced German pronunciation, where countless family discussions had resolved or escalated over decades. Helen continued. "Margaret violated your rules. That's wrong, and she knows it. But Thomas, you need to see what she was actually doing. Not betrayal, not romance. Just teaching two young people, learning from each other." "They could have been doing anything," Thomas protested. "I walk in and find them alone." "And they were reading," Helen said firmly. "Books between them, teaching each other languages. If you're going to punish her for intellectual curiosity and compassion, then you're punishing the values we raised her with." Thomas sat in silence, wrestling with competing instincts. Protect daughter, maintain rules. acknowledge the actual situation wasn't what he'd feared. Finally, Thomas said, "I need to think about this. Margaret, you're confined to the house tomorrow. No field work, no barn visits. Karl, I need to decide what to report." "You're going to report him?" Margaret asked, horrified. "He'll be punished for something I initiated. That's not fair." "Fair is maintaining proper boundaries," Thomas replied. "I'll sleep on it." That night, Thomas lay awake, processing what he'd witnessed. His daughter teaching a German prisoner. The prisoner teaching his daughter books and languages and laughter in a barn while war raged overseas. Helen spoke into the darkness. "You know what you saw wasn't wrong." "It violated regulations," Thomas said. "So does speeding. So does black market coffee. So does listening to the radio after curfew during air raid drills. Some violations matter, some don't. You need to decide which category this falls into. What if other farmers find out? What if the guards report it? What if our daughter learned compassion despite propaganda teaching her to hate?" Helen interrupted. "What if she demonstrated the values we tried to instill? What if she saw a human being instead of an enemy and chose understanding over fear?" Thomas had no response to that. At breakfast, Thomas announced his decision. "Margaret, you can return to your routine, but the barn meetings stop. If you want to continue this language exchange, it happens here, in the house, where your mother and I can supervise." Margaret stared. "You're allowing it?" "With conditions," Thomas said. "The young man comes here 1 evening per week, sits at this table, teaches you German while you teach him English, under supervision. No secret meetings, no hidden notes. Transparent and appropriate." "Why?" Margaret asked. "Because your mother's right," Thomas admitted. "What you were doing wasn't wrong, just how you were doing it. And because—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Because maybe understanding the enemy isn't betrayal. Maybe it's how we remember they're human, even when we're fighting them." That evening, Karl arrived at the farmhouse, escorted by a guard who had been briefed on the new arrangement. He entered nervously, uncertain what to expect. Thomas met him at the door. "You'll sit at that table with my daughter for 1 hour," he said. "You'll teach her German. She'll teach you English. You'll drink the coffee my wife provides, and you'll be respectful and appropriate. Clear." "Very clear, sir," Karl said. "Thank you for allowing this." "I'm not allowing it for you," Thomas said bluntly. "I'm allowing it because my daughter wants it, and my wife convinced me it's not harmful. Don't make me regret this." They sat at the kitchen table, Margaret, Karl, and Helen acting as chaperone. Thomas worked on farm accounts in the next room, close enough to hear every word. The first session was awkward. Both Margaret and Karl were hyper-aware of being observed, of having permission where before they'd had secrecy. But gradually, the rhythms returned. Books opened, words exchanged, languages practiced. Helen brought coffee and cookies, sat knitting while they worked. She asked Karl about his family, his studies, his hopes for after the war. He answered carefully, aware Thomas was listening, wanting to demonstrate he was no threat. By the session's end, something had shifted. What began as secretly forbidden had become openly permitted. The clandestine thrill was gone, but something more substantial replaced it. Legitimate intellectual exchange, acknowledged and accepted by the family. The Tuesday evening language sessions became routine. Karl arrived at sunset, spent an hour at the Crawford table, returned to camp with the guard. Progress accelerated. With regular practice, Margaret's German improved until she could read novels. Haltingly, Karl's English became fluent enough for complex discussion. They covered literature, philosophy, history, everything except the war itself, which remained unspoken, taboo. Thomas listened from the next room, initially suspicious, gradually convinced this was exactly what it appeared. Two young people teaching each other, bridging cultures through language and ideas. Other prisoners noticed, asked Karl where he went Tuesday evenings. He explained carefully, not wanting to create jealousy or problems. Some prisoners thought he was foolish to spend free time studying. Others understood the hunger for intellectual engagement that labor couldn't satisfy. The guards noticed too, reported it to camp authorities who investigated, found nothing improper, and allowed it to continue as an experiment in prisoner-civilian relations, if it remained appropriate, if it caused no problems. It demonstrated that some interaction was possible without compromising security or regulations. In late September, the harvest concluded. The wheat was in. The prisoners' work on the Crawford farm finished. They would be reassigned to other farms, other labor, wherever need existed. The final Tuesday session carried weight. Both Margaret and Karl felt but didn't acknowledge directly. This was probably their last meeting. After this, he would return to camp, eventually to Germany, and they would likely never see each other again. They worked through their usual lessons, but slower, both reluctant to finish. Helen brought extra cookies. Thomas came into the kitchen, sat at the table, and spoke directly to Karl for the first time beyond basic instructions. "You've been good for my daughter," Thomas said. "Challenged her mind, taught her things I couldn't. I appreciate that, even though this whole situation is irregular." "Thank you for allowing it, sir," Karl replied. These evenings, they reminded me that life exists beyond war, that minds can meet, even when countries fight. "What will you do after the war?" Thomas asked. "Return to university, if it still exists," Karl said. "Finish my degree, become teacher, maybe help rebuild what was destroyed." "Good," Thomas said. "The world will need teachers after this." Karl was transferred to a camp in Kansas in October, then to a facility in Virginia in early 1945. He wrote to Margaret through official POW mail channels, letters heavily censored, but still maintaining their literary and linguistic exchange. "Dear Margaret, I am now in Virginia working food processing. Very different from wheat fields, but work is work. I practice English daily with other prisoners. Your teaching made me best English speaker in her barracks. Thank you for this gift. Virginia is beautiful, even in winter. Mountains remind me of Germany, though these are older, softer. I think much about what comes after war, about rebuilding, about how people like us who learn to see past enemy designations will help create different future. Keep reading, keep learning, keep questioning. These are most important skills for any time, but especially for times of recovery. Your student and teacher, Karl." Margaret wrote back, regularly sharing her own progress in German, her college plans, her brother's letters from Europe. The correspondence continued through war's end and into the occupation period. Karl was repatriated in 1946, returned to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the country he'd left. Heidelberg was damaged, but partially intact. The university was reopening, slowly accepting students who could prove they hadn't been deeply involved with the regime's worst programs. Karl enrolled, completed his degree, became a teacher of English and American literature at a gymnasium in Heidelberg. He married in 1950, had 3 children, lived a quiet academic life, shaped by the understanding that enemies were simply people you hadn't yet bothered to understand. He corresponded with Margaret sporadically over decades. She attended college, became a teacher herself, married a history professor, raised 2 children in Lincoln, Nebraska. Their letters discussed books, education, the strange experience of having been enemies who never acted like enemies. In 1984, Karl visited the United States for an academic conference. He was 62, Margaret 57. They arranged to meet in Lincoln, 40 years after teaching each other languages. In a Nebraska barn and farmhouse, they met at a cafe, 2 elderly people who had known each other as young adults in extraordinary circumstances. The recognition was immediate, despite the decades. They talked for hours about their lives, their families, their careers, about how those Tuesday evening sessions had shaped their understanding of the war and its aftermath, about how learning language together had taught them that culture and nationality mattered when less than curiosity and compassion. "I tell my students about you," Karl said, "about the American girl who taught me English despite regulations forbidding it, about how understanding begins with willingness to listen, to learn, to see past what propaganda tells us about enemies." "I tell my students, too," Margaret replied, "about the German prisoner who loved books and learning, about how my father caught us teaching each other and chose to allow it rather than punish it, about how small acts of understanding matter more than grand gestures." "Your father made brave choice," Karl observed, "going against fear and rules because he saw no actual harm." "He did," Margaret agreed. "It changed how I understood courage. At some times, bravery is allowing things that challenge your assumptions." Thomas Crawford died in 1972, never regretting his decision to permit those Tuesday sessions. Helen lived until 1989, telling the story to grandchildren as an example of how compassion and wisdom sometimes require breaking rules. Margaret died in 2005, Karl in 2007. Both left behind families, students, and the story of how they bridged the enemy divide through books and language and patient teaching. The story persists as a reminder that even in war, intellectual connection is possible, that enemy designations break down when individuals choose to see each other as humans rather than abstractions, that a father catching his daughter teaching a prisoner could respond with understanding rather than rage. In a barn, in Nebraska, in August 1944, 2 young people violated regulations by teaching each other languages. When discovered, they were allowed to continue under supervision. That decision to permit understanding rather than enforce separation created ripples that extended through decades, not because the teachings stopped the war or changed its outcome, but because it demonstrated that even between enemies, learning is possible. That compassion can coexist with caution, that the most dangerous violations are sometimes the most necessary ones. Thomas Crawford caught his daughter doing something forbidden. She was teaching a German prisoner English. The prisoner was teaching her German. They were sharing books and ideas, and the radical notion was that human curiosity transcends nationality. And Thomas, in a moment that defined his character, chose to allow it, to supervise rather than suppress, to trust his daughter's judgment and his own observation that this violation wasn't harming anyone. That choice matters more than the rules it broke, because it taught Margaret that understanding isn't betrayal, taught Karl that some Americans chose compassion over fear, and taught everyone who heard the story later that small acts of bridge building matter, especially during times of great division. This is what endures. Not the scandal of the violation, but the wisdom of the response. Not the enemy designation, but the shared love of learning that made enemy designation irrelevant. Not the rules broken, but the understanding built in their breaking.